Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant. Today, I'm going to be covering a book that's been highly requested, partially by comments on other D&D videos, and partially by friends asking me to cover this, but I'm going to be covering the 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide. Now, if you look this up online, you see a lot of interesting comments about it. A lot of it praise for how broad its scope is and how good the advice is. One thing I do want to comment on that I really have appreciated is that the cover art, and let me show you that again, that crystal ball um that the red dragon is pondering, that orb that it is pondering, is actually the cover art of the player's handbook for 4th edition. So, this is the cover art for the player's handbook, and this, and I'll try and get it zoomed in, is what that little crystal ball looks like. And so, one, it's a really neat change to the design of the covers. And I say that because when you look at the 3rd edition player's handbooks and the Dungeon Master's guides, it's this tome looking thing, very arcane, very almost like the sort of thing you would see in a wizard's study in the setting itself. Whereas this is a scene that you see in that setting. The credited author on the cover is James Wyatt, and there's some other big names as well: Rob Heinzu, Andy Collins, Bill Slavisek, Mike Merles, Christopher Perkins as Story Design and Development Manager. Building on previous editions, E. Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson for 1st edition and earlier, David Zeb Cook for 2nd edition, Jonathan Tweet, Monty Cook, Skip Williams, Richard Baker, Peter Atkinson, 3rd edition, dedicated to the memory of E. Gary Gygax, and this was published this is a first printing, June 2008, and E. Gary Gygax passed away in March of 2008. So the player's handbook was first from June of 2008 as well, and so as they were putting together the final copies for the books, they probably would have been adding in that line in the credits, dedicated to the memory of E. Gary Gygax. This one, like I said, is first printing June 2008. I know it looks in really great condition, and flipping through the pages, I agree. However, this was bought used at Coaz Books in Las Cruces, New Mexico for $17.48. There are some interesting aspects to this book that I think do it justice and that are the reason why it is so well received by people that have read it and that have played Dungeons and Dragons 4th editions throughout the last almost 20 years. Personally, though, I use it for very 4th edition specific content, such as the section on rewards, or the section on building encounters, or the section on traps, and that sort of thing. So, for an example, this is what the pages on traps looks like. And let me read a specific one that I have used a couple times. Flame Jet. It's a level 8 blaster with bypassing the trap, netting you 350 experience. 2 hidden nozzles let loose a blast of flame. Trap. When the trap is triggered, 2 hidden nozzles in the walls attack each round on their initiative. And their initiative is +5. So you roll d20 +5 every time on a round that number comes up. Flame Jet does its thing to anything in the line of its attack. Does a close blast 3, all creatures in blast, +11 verse reflex, 3d8 +4 fire damage, ongoing 5 fire damage save ends, and there's countermeasures listed. An adjacent character can disable 1 flame jet with a DC 24 thievery check. A character can engage in a skill challenge to deactivate the control panel, DC 28 thievery, complexity 1, so you need 4 successes before 2 failures. That, however, references another thing from this book that wasn't well implemented when 4th edition first came out, and had further been modified and corrected in the DMG2, which I do not own a copy of myself. But a skill challenge should be an interaction with a trap or a puzzle or a chase scene or diplomacy where multiple skills are relevant. So this countermeasure saying, do a skill challenge, DC 28 thievery, complexity, all that means is you're doing a bunch of rolling on the same check. And if that's the case, then just disable the flame jet with 2 different DC 24 thievery checks. Why would you want to waste 6 skill checks when 2 will do the trick just fine? And so there are aspects of this that are really interesting, and the traps I like, but as always, something slips through the crack that makes it less than ideal. I actually had a adventure in my 4th edition game. It was the Paragon tier, which is to say levels 11 through 20. And one of the masked lords of Waterdeep that I included in this game is a master trapsmith and an adventurer. He had been a thief and a rogue in his younger days, and had settled down with enough fortune and enough expertise in trap disabling that he also became the guy for home defense. And eventually he ended up becoming a masked lord. And I used a lot of these traps in the design of both his house in Waterdeep as well as his manor in the countryside at a farm, like a farming region, a town where he was the baron. And what actually happened in the story was that he had been assassinated by some Yuan-Ti, and they were using a mask to hide their appearance. And since he would have been known for being secretive, having a mask to cover his visage would have been in character, so it wouldn't have raised alarms. But through his influence, because again, the Yuan-Ti were impersonating him. Through that influence, they were able to get some like fast travel pedestals, which had been discovered and kind of reinvented twice by the two actual opposite sides of a conflict. And so the Yuan-Ti used it to get into Waterdeep and thus start doing some terroristic activities using spell-scarred victims as kind of like IEDs. They were smuggling in these Yuan-Ti agents and then kidnapping spell-scarred people from within Waterdeep and activating the spell scar, causing magic in ideally an explosive way in a busy, crowded street. And thus they were testing their methods, refining their methods in a larger region than the Grey Vale, which they had been doing that a decade earlier. And in the process, they dragged the heroes, the party, the main characters of this story, from the Grey Vale, this smaller backwater farming and low urban region. They dragged those heroes to Waterdeep, or caused problems such that the Waterdavian lords requested and hired those heroes to go to Waterdeep and stop them, thus allowing the Yuan-Ti to start influencing the Grey Vale when their greatest defenders were not around. A lot of that has, the traps were used by the Yuan-Ti when they were impersonating this guy, and that was helpful. The rewards section has been helpful for a long time, just because I like rolling for things when I can. And in this case, a chance to roll for treasure makes it a bit more dynamic. I'm not always just giving my players something they want, but an opportunity for them to find something cool. So, as an example, to use that lord, that impersonated lord, he had on a observatory, a lunar observatory on the roof of his house in Waterdeep, there was also like an entertainment section where he had a bar, a few seats, some alcohol stored, including some whiskey that had been, it might have been it might have been bourbon, but it was alcohol that had been magically preserved in a glass case, and the date on the alcohol predated the spell plague. And so that was one of the things I rolled for, like, party level 12, the monetary treasure. It was like one gold piece, 1 1500 gold piece art object or something like that, where it was, I'm treating it as an art object because they could sell that for same value rather than for discounted value. But when the players saw that, they instead kept it preserved and have brought it back to their house in the Grey Vale in Loudwater so that they can then eventually use it when they do something worth celebrating. The treasure parcels have been really helpful for me in my own gameplay, but also to talk about the kinds of things that get this book the kind of renown that it deserves. Let's see, chapter 6 is Adventures, and 96 and 97, pages 96 and 97 are under the headline Published Adventures. And I focus on this page because the adventure I've been running in 4th edition for the last 3 years now is a modification of a published adventure from the Forgotten Realms campaign guide. The opening chapter of that book is about this series of events in the town of Loudwater in the Grey Vale, which, like I said earlier, is kind of a backwater, low population, mostly rural, low urban kind of region. And in the one urban center in the Grey Vale, there is some shenanigans going on. First, it's goblins attacking, and then once they come back, there's bandits that are involved in the area, slave trading that's going on in the area. You're supposed to track them down to the ruins of a town called Zelbras, where a greenscale marsh mystic, a reptilian human caster, is present and is leading these bandits to transport these slaves. And something I added, and this is partially in line with the text on this page. I didn't use it because I have some experience as a dungeon master and as a player. I'd been playing D&D for more than a decade before starting up this 4E game. One of the segments in here, the subheading is Hook Them In. The first thing to consider is how to stitch the published adventure into your campaign. In order for it to feel like a seamless part of your campaign story, you need to weave threads out from it in both directions, backward into the previous adventures and forward into the following ones. And so that's kind of what I did. When the capstone for this adventure happened, there had been dwarven pedestals used for fast travel between two different points, a bandit in the town of Loudwater hiding out in an abandoned church that had some broken fragments from one of those pedestals and had notes that they were going to sell it once they figured it out to the Yuan Ti, who were interested. But then also the slave traders that were shipping kidnapped children. All of this was happening, but to tie it into a longer campaign to involve 4th edition lore, I added in the spell plague as a component to the plot. So all of the victims within that trafficking plot were young, they were teenaged or younger, and they all had spell scars because rather than having adults who couldn't really fit in these barrels, they had people that could. And then when they got to the Greenscale Marsh Mystic, the last resort of that character was, if I'm gonna go down, you're not gonna save any of the kids. He activated one of the spell scars remotely using a rod, which would be an implement in 4th edition, and then proceeded to cause an explosion. And it was then revealed and kind of discovered none of the party had any healing ability. So I want to say 2 of the youth in that cage died, 4 of them were badly injured or burned, and part of the section here highlights how you can use those kinds of elements into a longer form story. I wanted to do something where the Yuan-Ti were the villains because snake people, good idea for a villain. So the Yuan-Ti were going to be the villains. They were going to be trafficking humans, specifically youth, that were going to be used against their will for terroristic activities, which, as far as GMing a story goes, to hook people into a villainous plot to make them want to be heroes that stops that plot, those are very good triggers for people. And so the players then were very active. They wanted to find these Yuan-Ti. They wanted to stop them in their tracks. And it's progressed to the point where now they're level 14, I think. And they are actively going after the Yuan-Ti communities to try and depose the current leaders and prevent further attacks on goodly and innocent folks of the Sword Coast and the Forgotten Realms. Under Hook Them In, it says, plan forward. As you're planning the game sessions, always be thinking about the adventure you're going to run next. And sure enough, on my phone, I've got a note full of plot hooks, so on and so forth, encounters they're going to see, villains named and unnamed. Use adventure hooks. Most published adventures provide adventure hooks designed to draw characters into the plot of the adventure. And in the Forgotten Realms campaign guide, they have blurbs about how the ancient dwarven civilization of Azanulbazar or something like that had these pedestals that allowed them to travel from one distant fortress to another, or from one city to another in a moment, in a single moment, just instantaneously. That magical technology has been lost to the sands of time, but the rediscovery of it by these goblins in this borrow for an old ancient dwarven king, the rediscovery of those pedestals could be an adventure hook. And so I saw that, I thought, yeah, that's a pretty cool thing. If the players are, if the Yuan-Ti are trying to invade, they want to learn how that technology works and then implement it on their own so they can invade without weeks of overland travel. And so it became the job of the players to go around to these dwarven settlements that had these pedestals and destroy them or keep them from getting into the Yuan-Ti's hands. And so, once again, using those adventure hooks, tying in NPCs and groups, all of these things work really well. One of the things that we had was a recurring guard that I ended up using the name Theodore because I usually like using kind of 19th and 17th century English names for NPCs. And I also like using weird combinations. So like Timothy and James becomes Jimothy, or Robert and William becomes Wilbert. Things like that. And this one was a bit unique because he had just a normal sounding name, Theodore. And he was a young human guard. He had been called to the scene of multiple encounters in Loudwater, and as the players recognized him, they began to incorporate him into their adventures. That if the town of Loudwater needed a personal representative to confirm the events that the adventurers are claiming, that this person would be a good, reliable witness. And so, tying in NPCs and groups is a good way to do that. plant location hooks or maps. All of this is utilized in the Forgotten Realms campaign guide and helped me make my own adventure. And so that's just 2 pages, but like I've said, there's also other pages in here. There's, the sections on rewards, experience, and monetary. There's sections on traps. There's sections on skill challenges. There's sections on crafting the adventures. A lot of it can be specific to 4th edition, such as experience rewards, encounter design, traps, monetary rewards, that sort of thing. But then a lot of it, like skill challenges, like adventure design, a lot of that's very broadly applicable. And then one thing that really helped me was the default 4th edition setting, the Nentier Vale. And it describes Fallcrest, which is the central town of the region, and then proceeds to kind of expand upon some encounters in the area. So this is the town of Fallcrest. The book says it's only a town of 1350, so 1350. There's a lot of houses and whatnot that I think it would probably be a bit bigger. And then when you incorporate the surroundings, it says another 900 live in the countryside within a few miles of the town. So all told, there's about 2,250 people in the vicinity of this town, and it describes, the maps, the conditions of the town, that it used to be a much grander town and is in decline, that certain sections of neighborhood, so like if you'll look, all of this like southern section has rubble in it, and those are neighborhoods that are in decline. The houses have fallen apart, and so Fallcrest has been helpful. I used basically that to expand upon the town of Succomber in the western edges of the Grey Vale. So Loudwater, Zelbras is a ruined town, and further downstream is Succomber. And there were plot hooks from the Forgotten Realms campaign guide, and I'll go over that more in another video. But especially that book I'm going to go over because it's got a lot of good information. But the Fallcrest aspect of this really helpful. Looking at it from a 4th edition GM perspective, this was very helpful and continues to be very productive for me in my own game design and in my own adventure design. So I appreciate it mostly as a 4E D&D dungeon master, but I understand why other people reading through this may appreciate this book as a introductory guide for how to GM. And that's something a lot of indie RPGs don't really do, is get into the nitty-gritty of how do you actually run an adventure. Not, you'll see that, I see this in like Tales from Myriad or a newer really small game called Setting Off. They discuss tools that the GM can use to run the game better and tools that they can use to make adventures for that game, but it's very specific to that game. It's not advice that is necessarily broadly applicable. And so that's what I appreciate this book for, is how broadly applicable it can be. So I would recommend this if you are playing, mostly if you're playing like D&D or one of its derivatives. This guide is going to be useful. Unfortunately, the information in it also comes paired with information on the 4th edition of Dungeons and Dragons, so it may have some reduced relevance to you if you're using it for other games. But I really appreciate it. Like I said, I found it for $17.50 in the condition it's in. That is fantastic. And yeah. My name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant.